This week on Myth, we're sailing out to one of the most isolated communities on the planet. You'll see that meeting the Europeans is usually a bad thing, that you can totally navigate the open ocean with vague directions, and that you need to hide your traps better. Then, in Gods and Monsters, it's the origin story for some of the most iconic statues in the world. This is the Myths Your Teacher Hated podcast, where I tell the stories of cultures from around the world in all of their original, bloody, uncensored glory. Modern tellings of these stories have become dry and dusty, but I'll be trying to breathe new life into them. This is episode 101, Islands in the Stream. As always, this episode is not safe for work. This week, we're headed out into the wild blue yonder to visit one of the most remote inhabited islands in the world, Rapa Nui, better known in English as Easter Island. Unfortunately, as has so often been the case, the arrival of European colonizers beginning on Easter Sunday, April 5, 1722, devastated the local population. Rongo-Rongo, the local language, or possibly proto-language, scholars are divided on the issue, has never been deciphered. Knowledge of the unique glyphs, which could be one of the very few completely independent inventions of writing in world history, was lost as the Rapa Nui people were ravaged by European diseases and were kidnapped by European slavers. The most famous element of Rapa Nui, the enormous stone statues known as the moai, were originally carved and raised between 1250 and 1500. They were primarily the faces of the deified ancestor spirits and chiefs, and towered over the island up to 33 feet tall, gazing inland toward the villages under their protection. Sometime between 1722 and 1868, all of the completed statues were toppled by the Rapa Nui, destroying most of them. It has been theorized that the protector statues were destroyed in response to the horrors that befell the island after European contact, as they had been proven to be ineffective when they were needed most. In recent years, about 50 of the moai have been re-erected on their Ahu platforms or in museums around the world. As a result of these many factors, much of the Rapa Nui mythology has been lost to time. One of the stories that has survived is that of King Hotumatua and his people fleeing their home in Hiva for a new land. Various versions have been recorded by different writers and explorers, including William J. Thompson in 1891, Catherine Rutledge in 1919, Alfred Matreau in 1971, and Thomas S. Batherell in 1974. Modern scholars hold that either the storyteller or the interpreter got the directions backward, since the story claims that these people came to Rapa Nui from the direction of the rising sun, a direction that is notably empty of any islands that could possibly have been their origin. Many years ago, Hotumatua and his followers lived in a group of islands that lay far towards the rising sun, known as the Marae Tohau, which means the burial place. It was a terrible, inhospitable place that was so intensely hot that people frequently died from the awful heat. Plants that were planted would often shrivel up and die, scorched by the burning power of the sun. Hotumatua succeeded his father, who had been powerful and widely respected, as chief of his people. Hotumatua had been in charge for a few years when his brother Macha fell in love with a maiden famed for her beauty and grace. Unfortunately, he was not the only one to seek the hand of this amazing woman. Aroi, the chief of a powerful rival clan known as the Hanua Epe, was determined to beat his rival for her love. Aroi and his people had invaded Hiva and taken one side for themselves. For her part, this young beauty found it impossible to choose between these two great men. Her heart was torn between them, and she flirted with both, urging on first one and then the other, until both Macha and Aroi were absolutely inflamed with passion for her. Everyone could see that this situation was building to an explosion of violence, so her family finally insisted that she make a decision. After much consideration and agonizing, the young maiden announced that she would marry Aroi, but on one condition. He would need to prove his love by making a pilgrimage around the island. He would need to walk without pause, neither resting nor stopping to eat day or night until his circuit was completed. Not being heartless, she did allow the chief to bring along retainers to carry his food to eat as he walked on his declaration of love. She even walked beside Aroi and his retainers for the first few miles of the journey and, when they separated, she vowed to think of nothing but her beloved Aroi until his return. Unfortunately, she was still every bit as fickle as ever, and, as soon as her betrothed was out of sight and out of mind, she missed Macha and went back to his strong arms. Their passion convinced the pair to elope that very night, even as Aroi was still on his feet of endurance to prove his love for the woman who couldn't remain faithful for a single night. News of this betrayal reached Aroi only as he arrived at the far end of the island. He understandably called off the rest of his now meaningless journey and rushed straight home. He threw a great feast and invited all of the warriors of his clan to eat at his table. Once they had eaten his food and shared in his hospitality, he shared with them the terrible insult that Matcha and their shared lady love had committed against Oroi. The assembled warriors were horrified by this betrayal and happily vowed an oath to not rest until Matcha and his entire family, including Hotumatua, had been executed. Now the chief Hotumatua had a spiritual advisor named Haumaka, who'd had a dream in which his spirit traveled to a distant land in search of a new home, though they hadn't known at the time why they would need such a thing. Haumaka awoke and told his brother Hautava about his dream, which had been an extremely detailed tour of the island naming many of the important places, and was told to inform the king. Hotumatua sent his 2 sons Ira and Raparenga, along with Huatava's 5 sons Kuku, Ringiringi, Nonoma, Ure, and Makoi, to build a canoe and search for the Dream Island. All they had to go on were the following directions: Ilunga, Itau, Iravariva, and Iroto Itira, which translates to upwind or southeast into the trade winds, it juts out, a permanent contour, and in the midst of the rising sun. Not the most explicit directions for exploring the open sea. Still, the gods were with them, and the 7 young men found the island revealed by the god Makemake. They explored the island and found many of the places located by Haumaka in the dream. They caught many fish with their bare hands and tossed them ashore to eat for dinner. Ira also saw a turtle and, figuring it would make a hearty meal, tried to lift it, but it was far too heavy. Raparenga tried as well, but had no more success. Kuku decided to show them both up and, to everyone's surprise, actually managed to lift the turtle off the ground. The turtle, who happened to be a kuhane, or spirit, struck the young man on the back, shattering his spine, and then swam back to Hiva. Kuku begged the others not to abandon him, but they couldn't stay with him forever. They needed to continue on and then report on what they had found. Kuku was taken to a cave and 6 stones were piled up beside the entrance to take their places looking over their brother as they left. Alas, Kuku died there, alone and abandoned in the cave. They discovered a surfing spot and rode the waves to more places on the island shore. While the others were busy surfing for fun and exploration, Ira and his brother Raparenga went around secretly placing some stone figures they had brought from Hiva. 3 were set up on the shore with shining mother-of-pearl necklaces that could be seen from far out on the ocean to make it easier to find the place again. The 6 surviving explorers then met a man named Nga Tavake, who had come to the island before them for reasons that are not adequately explained. They warned him that the land was bad, with only grass growing where yams had been planted. They then proved this to be a huge lie by going to the yam farm that had been planted by Kuku, rest in peace, and weeding it. Deciding that they had thoroughly explored the island, the 6 young men returned to Hiva to report to their king. While they had been gone, the Hanu Epe had tried to move the border and expand their territory, but many had been captured and imprisoned. With word finally arriving that the Dream Island existed, Hotumatua made the tough decision to abandon their home and sail his people, 300 in total, in 2 large double canoes, said to be 90 feet long and 6 feet deep. The warriors of the Hanu Ipe saw the preparations for this journey and launched a battle to try and kill Matcha and his brother, as well as to rescue their captured brethren, but they were repulsed. Hotumatua ordered his people to set sail that very night, bringing along with them their captured prisoners as an insurance policy. The 2 canoes made the long voyage across the open sea and came to the island the 7 explorers had mapped out on their previous trip. Hotumatua led one of the boats, and another man named Honga Hinariru, who wrote the Rongo Rongo and had almost as much mana as the chief, led the other. Mana is a concept among the Rapa Nui people of spiritual or divine strength. In many cases, tattoos were used both as a representation of social class and as a receptor for mana, which those blessed by the gods could use to do incredible things. Being very powerful in his own right, Honga Hinariru used his mana and that of a man named Teke, who was also in his canoe, to establish 14 new fishing grounds in various places around the island. Hotumatua, determined not to be outdone, resolved to be the first to land at Anakena, an anchorage on the north side of the island that had been chosen as the future site of the royal residence. He ordered a spell chanted to make his own boat move faster, and to make Honga Hinariru's to go slower, giving him time to establish 2 new fishing grounds of his own before landing first. Once everyone was ashore, the 2 canoes were disassembled so that the precious wood could be used to build houses for the people. Seedlings were distributed to the island's new inhabitants, and the captured Hanu Epe were ordered to be settled somewhere suitable for them to do much of the heavy farming labor of getting the new home settled properly. A man named Iku, which means insect, was installed as a puppet king of the Hanu Epe in order to keep them in line and working. While everyone was distracted by these activities, another figure slipped ashore from the canoes before they were taken apart. It was none other than Oroi, who had managed to sneak onto Hotumanua's canoe disguised as a servant without being discovered. He hid himself on the island and waited for an opportunity to wreak havoc. That chance came not long after when 5 children of a loyal man named Roro went to bathe at a small cove named Movahe. Once they were nice and clean, they climbed onto a rock out in the water to sunbathe and dry off. As they lay there on their bellies, Oroi swam silently out to the rock. He captured a lobster and fashioned its shell into a weapon. One by one, he rammed the lobster weapon up the assholes of the sunbathing children and ripped their insides out. And yes, the story is very specific about the method of death. When the children didn't return, Roro asked their mother where they had gone. She directed him out to the rock where they had gone sunbathing, but it had been lost beneath the high tide. Once enough time had passed that the water level dropped again, he saw the mutilated corpses of his children rotting there on the rock. Roro knew violence intimately, and it was very clear to him that their deaths had not been an accident or an animal attack. They had been murdered. After establishing that the captured Hano Epe all had rock-solid alibis, Roro came to the undeniable conclusion that someone else must have come to the island somehow. It didn't take much pondering to come to the conclusion that Oroi was responsible. He took his suspicions to the king. Concerned, the king decided to confer with his adopted daughter Verihina, who lived with her husband in Mahatua. Oroi was waiting for them. Anticipating this little trek, the hidden enemy left a noose trap lying across the road to snare the king. Having been warned about the possible existence of an assassin on the island, he was forewarned and forearmed, so he saw the trap and skirted around it. Calling together his daughter and his son-in-law, he told them about his concerns. "I need you to follow me and watch for signs above me. If the dark turns circle high above, I will live. But if they dive down at me, I am surely dead." They agreed to follow the king and watch his back. Hotumatua made his way carefully back along the path and saw that the noose still lay in waiting. Oroi was here. Glancing up, he saw that the turns were circling high above, which gave him hope. The king took a deep breath. "I hope I'm not about to get my ass handed to me," he said, and took a deliberate step into the noose. The rope yanked his foot out from beneath him, dropping Hotumatua heavily to the ground. Oroi leapt out of his hiding place, bone knife held high. Kicking sharply with his free foot, Hotumatua bought himself precious seconds to summon his mana and cast a spell at his would-be murderer. The magic caught Oroi square in the chest, stopping his heart mid-beat, and the enemy chief toppled over into the dust. Having seen the scuffle from afar, Verihina and her husband rushed down from their vantage point to check on her father. Both combatants had crashed to the earth, leaving them terrified that both had died. They were relieved to find Hotumatua disentangling his foot from the snare next to the bloodless corpse of Oroi. They knew that the dead chief had also been powerful in mana, and needed to be further dealt with to make sure he stayed good and fucking dead. The 3 of them gathered up the corpse and carried it back home to cook in the oven. Hotumatua lit the flames, which rushed into the dead man with an unearthly cry as Oroi sat up, very much alive again. Unfortunately, Verihina and her husband were waiting for just such a thing, and so they bashed him across the skull until he was once again good and dead. This oven wasn't going to do the trick, so they took him over to the other side of the island. The Ahu there was able to cook the corpse to charred flesh with ease, and it was later named Oroi after the dead chief. His corpse nicely broiled now, the assembled family ate his flesh, likely to take his mana as their own. Having secured Rapa Nui for his people, Hotumatua set up his home in Oramanga in a house called Hare Tupatu. Years went by in peace until his eldest son Tu Maheke was 15. The king's cook Rovi went to catch a naki, or eel, as a side dish for their sweet potatoes. The best eels were a long distance away from the house, and so Ravi stayed away overnight. Likewise, the boy's mother Vakai left to dig up sweet potatoes for the meal, leaving the king alone with his son. The story doesn't explain why, but the teenager apparently began to cry, which pissed off the king who, to be fair, apparently had a splitting headache. Being a right bastard of a father, he screamed insults at his son rather than trying to help or at least ask nicely to be kind to his aching head. "Stop your fucking crying, you goddamned bastard! You weeping, sniveling crybaby!" When this predictably did nothing to make him stop crying, Hotumatua stormed out. Vakai came back to find her beloved son weeping silently, eyes swollen and red. She asked him what had happened, and he told her all about what his father had said. She cooked dinner for her son to help him feel a little better, then went to confront the king. "You asshole. Tupatu is not the bastard. You are. Your real father was Taya Mahia. Kokiri too was your foster father, you dick. Next time, keep a fucking civil tongue in your head. Hotu Matua was shocked at this news and distraught that no one had ever bothered to tell him the truth about his own parentage, and he hopefully also felt guilty about being a shitty dad. The king ruled over the island for many years of relative peace and prosperity, and he grew old. Hotu Matua could sense that his time was at an end. He fit the last 2 stones of a great construction project together, his last work in this life, and then called his children together to receive his final blessings. That done, he went to Orongo to announce his imminent death. Looking out across the sea toward his long-lost homeland Hiva, he called out to his guardian spirits Kohi and Kuaha. "Let the rooster of Ariana crow soft and sad. The stem with many roots, the king of Rapa Nui, is coming to the land of the spirits." Even as his voice echoed over the waves, he collapsed to the sand and died. His children collected his body and brought it to Akahanga and buried him in Hario'ava. His eldest son, Tumaheke, I'm not sure if this is the same boy with a different name or an inconsistency in the tale, cut off the dead king's head, dried and cleaned it, wrapped it in tava, and hid it in a stone crevice. The reasons for this are not explained, but I would assume it had some spiritual significance, possibly associated with the ancestor spirits who watched over the island. Perhaps this was the first step in making the king one of these protectors. On the other hand, maybe the son just really hated his asshole of a dad and wanted one posthumous fuck you. I'm leaning a little bit towards the second based on what happened next. A man named Urehonu was out weeding his banana plantation when a rat wandered up, bold as brass. This little furry critter didn't act like a normal rat. It showed far too much intelligence and curiosity for that. Urehonu was intrigued by this strange turn of events and decided to follow the furry little bugger, which just so happened to be Hotu Matua's spirit. It led him through the banana trees to a hole where, to his surprise, he found a dried yellow skull. Urehonu wasn't entirely sure what to make of this development, but it was very clearly something he had been led to by the spirits, so he decided to keep the skull. When he built a new home at Vaimata, he hung his macabre trophy on the wall. As was tradition, he threw a great feast to celebrate the building of his new house. Everyone who was anyone was there, including the king Tukoihu. He was shocked to recognize the old king's skull. Holy shit, those are the teeth that ate turtles and pigs back in Hiva. He thought that, as king, he should have the old king's skull, but he didn't want to ask for it and be denied by its owner, so he just straight up stole it. Having yoinked the skull, Tukoihu couldn't exactly display his ill-gotten booty, so he buried it under a stone near his house. He hadn't gotten away clean, though. Urehonu's foster son had spied the new king taking the skull. Furious at the insult, Urehonu gathered up a posse and set out in search of the stolen skull. They stormed the king's house and tore down a wall looking for it, but found nothing inside. They searched the grounds, digging up the earth itself. Through all of this, King Tukoihu had been sitting on a rock in the fields outside his home. This seemed odd. He hadn't so much as stood up to confront them for tearing the shit out of his house. The crowd snatched the king up, dragging him off the rock and rolling it aside. Sure enough, the skull was beneath it. Thus was Hotu Matua allowed to rest in peace, and his people prospered on the island for 1,000 years. Some scholars have pointed out the striking resemblance of the name of this mythical Rapa Nui king to the early founder god from Mangareva in the Gambler Islands in French Polynesia, Atu Motua. It is suspected that Hotu Matua was only added to the Rapa Nui mythology in the 1860s, when the Mangarevan language was also adopted. It's believed that the true first king was actually Tukoihu, who was reduced to a supporting character in Hotu Matua's story. And with the 2 founder kings firmly established, it's time for Gods and Monsters. This is a segment where I get into a little more detail about the personalities and history of one of the gods or monsters from the Six Pantheon that was not discussed in the main story. This week's guardian spirits are the Moai. Probably the most famous feature of Rapa Nui, the Moai, whose name means statue in the Rapa Nui language, are enormous human figures carved from stone. Despite the common image of them just being giant stone heads, the Moai do in fact have bodies, though the heads are quite oversized, typically making up 3/8 of the total statues. The iconic image of the disembodied heads comes from the fact that the standing Moai were toppled following European contact. It is believed that this mass toppling was either due to a crisis of faith following the horrors of European contact, disease, enslavement, and slaughter with advanced weapons, or as a result of intertribal war, with the statues toppled to destroy their power and weaken enemy forces. Most of the surviving statues were those that never made it out of the Ranu Raraku quarry, many of which were buried up to their shoulders. There is a truly fantastic story about the reasoning behind the moai's iconic shape that was part of the modern oral tradition of the Rapa Nui. The version here was narrated in 2013 by 60-year-old Carlos Edmonds of Hangaroa, Rapa Nui. When the settlers had first arrived in Rapa Nui from Hiva, Hotu Matua realized that they hadn't brought any moai and their guardian spirits with them. He sent 6 men to retrieve the moai named Tauto and bring it to their new home. Unfortunately, they dropped the moai as they were loading it onto the canoe and broke it into 2 parts. Hotu Matua had a vision of this terrible event and cried out. He rushed to the beach to watch for the return of the expedition, but the 6 men never returned. A few days later, the head and neck of Tauto did wash ashore, laden with mana, and in some versions was used as the model for later moai. It was Hotu Matua's grandson who first thought of crafting the moai to represent important people who had died. The first moai, known as Tai Hareatua, lies near the front of the quarry. The artists hadn't figured out their craft yet, and they couldn't decide how to finish the carving and get it out, so they left it where it was, forever unfinished. The man sent his 2 sons, Mira Ahotu and Tangete Akuahotu, to go back to Hiva and ask how the moai were made. He knew from the stories his grandfather, Hotu Matua, had told of their old home that there was a wise man who might still be alive who knew the secrets. The 2 young men traveled to distant Hiva to find the old man, named Kaveheke, who lived not far from the main town. They walked out to secret Ahumakare, near the coast, to ask how the moai were made. They found him busily occupied with his daily business. No matter how many times they asked him their questions or how many different ways they tried to phrase it, Kaveheke ignored the shit out of them. They waited a long time for him to say something, anything to them, but he never acknowledged their presence. Eventually, they grew frustrated and decided to leave. It was getting late, and he clearly wasn't going to help them, so there was no point in staying any longer. As they walked away, Kaveheke finally looked up and called out one enigmatic phrase. "Not to worry, just go. You have it down below." Or at least, it was something like that. It's difficult to translate the full context from the original Rapa Nui. The 2 young men hurried back to the wise old man. Unfortunately, he had gone back to ignoring the fuck out of them. They gave up much more quickly and wandered away again, though they kept one hopeful ear out for any further words of wisdom, but none were forthcoming. They discussed the cryptic words as they walked, but neither of them had any idea what they meant. They returned back to their own island and began the long trek home. As they came to a small forest, one of the 2 needed to take a piss. He pulled out his dick and began to pee when it dawned on him. Bro, look at my dick. This is what the wacky old man meant. Our penises are down below. That's what the moai need to look like." The 2 returned home and shared their wisdom with the island. From that point on, the moai were carved as enormous penises with a face and arms and eyes. That's it for this episode of Myths Your Teacher Hated. Keep up with new episodes on our Facebook page, on iTunes, on Stitcher, on TuneIn, on Verbal, and on Spotify. Or you can follow us on Twitter as @HardcoreMyth and on Instagram as Myths Your Teacher Hated Pod. You can also find news and episodes on our website at mythsyourteacherhated.com. If you have any questions, any gods or monsters you'd want to learn about, or any ideas for future stories that you'd like to hear, feel free to drop me a line. I'm trying to pull as much material from as many different cultures as possible, but there are all sorts of stories I've never heard, so suggestions are appreciated. The theme music is by Tiny Cheese Puff. Next time, we're heading off the forest path to meet one of the most famous fairy tale characters ever, Little Red Riding Hood. You'll see that you shouldn't feed a wolf shit and tell him it's pancakes, that little kids shouldn't drink an entire bottle of wine, and that the outhouse is a dangerous place. Then, in Gods and Monsters, it's the Taiwanese predecessor to the Big Bad Wolf, Great Aunt Tiger. That's all for now. Thanks for listening.